Hello and welcome. This VPAL signature event is brought to you by Harvard's Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning. Thank you all for joining us. We'll be talking with Carrie Lambert Beatty. Carrie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm a contemporary art historian. And if that sounds a little bit contradictory to you, that's for good reason. It is. It's a strange field that didn't really exist in the discipline of art history until around 2000. And it has certain problems, right? Art criticism is what the art writing that keeps up with what's happening as it happens. Art history, academia, is a lot slower. You know, the just past is essentially what contemporary art history winds up studying, which is essentially, when you think about it, sort of the out of fashion. It's like not old enough to be retro. It's basically what is not quite cool at the moment. That is my bailiwick. And what I've gradually come to realize over the years of working there is that, uncoolness, it's a calling. This is that there's a reason that this field exists, always a little bit behind the contemporary, which means together in time, contemporary. But art history is always a little bit afterward. And this is because contemporary art, which I think of as starting basically at the end of the Cold War, so we can use the date 1989, when conditions for art changed radically. The art market exploded. The field became gradually became more and more global, with different parts of the world making bids to participate in both markets and markets in attention and conversations. And so it became huge. It also became really fast. What art history can do is slow it down. So to be an art historian of the contemporary, I feel like gives a little bit of purpose to that behindness. We can slow it down. We can give art room for thinking. We can make room for reflection about art. And we can therefore give it sort of the space to do its cultural work, which I think that the kind of mechanisms of the market and the sort of forward zoom of fashion can constrain. So it almost doesn't have time to do cultural work, which is, of course, why art is made in the first place. So this is all background for today's topic, which is about what contemporary art might have to say about our post-truth condition. And I'm going to be looking at art from this uncool period of the just past, because I think it can help us think differently about the post-truth condition, and perhaps be a stimulus for ideas about ways that we can approach teaching, learning, and being agents of knowledge in today's world. So we tend to think of post-truth starting somehow in 2015, which is when it was the Oxford Dictionary's word of the year. And something definitely had changed by that moment as the Brexit and Trump campaigns of 2015-16 made clear. On the other hand, it is, 2005 was the word truthiness was the word of the year. And, we just had the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq, which was founded on a rationale that most people now understand as having been fraudulent. And so it's not as if this condition suddenly snapped into being in 2015. So where does the story start? For me, it started in 2006 in Vienna. This will be the first part of the talk. when I was doing a studio visit with the artist Michael Bloom, and he told me about this big installation he had just done at the Istanbul Biennial, one of those international exhibitions that is part of this huge global art circuit. And he had trained as a historian. He has a master's from the Sorbonne. And he got very interested in a lot of changes to the city that were happening at that time, including this building that he found that was going to be demolished that belonged to the family Bihar. And Safia Bihar, the daughter of that family, is an interesting historical figure, little known, who tended bar in her father's pub in the same building, and who sort of circulated amongst a group of cosmopolitan, modern thinking, even revolutionaries in Istanbul in the early 20th century. And relatively unknown is the fact that we have all of these letters between her and Mustafa Kemal, who would become the father of the Turkish Republic. And so Michael Bloom thought it was sad that this building was going to be gone, and with it, one piece of Safia Bahar's legacy. He was concerned that, she wasn't really a part of history as a woman. She was also Jewish in Istanbul, and her relationship with Mustafa Kemal. There's always been a sense that it may have been more of a love affair than a friendship. So what he did is to take the space that he had been given for his exhibition and turn it into a house museum to tell the story of Safia Bahar. And so this is what you would see as you entered, with explanations in Turkish and English. And the setup is basically furniture. Some of it was from her family that he was able to obtain. Some of it is just period things from the antique markets. And then here's another one. You see there's a plexiglass divider, very much like you would see in a lot of historical house museums. Information, photographs, letters in French between Kemal and Safia. Here she is later on when she was a bit of a feminist activist. And she's just this kind of amazing figure. And Michael Bloom is telling me this, and then he says, of course, Safia Bahar never actually existed. And he went on explaining why it was that he invented this historical character to present in the context of the biennial at a time when Turkey was trying to make a bid to be part of the EU, but was much less Islamist then than it is now. But that stereotype had been projected onto it. So there are all kinds of reasons that he started explaining the significance of why he invented this figure. Most of which I didn't hear because I was blushing so hard and wondering whether it would be more embarrassing or less embarrassing to just sort of faint and disappear, because I had just been nodding along. I didn't know anything about modern Turkey. I still know very, very little. And I didn't want to show that. So I sort of tried to keep up. I did something that psychologists call the knew it all along bias, which is one of those cognitive biases we have, so that as I heard him telling me these stories, I sort of almost remembered them. So yes, okay, I've heard about the Young Turks, right? Fez and Istanbul, sure, yes. But it's no illusion, of course. I also remember the sort of facial expression. It's the, I think I know what you're talking about. You squint, we practice it in the academy. It's definitely a part of the academic toolkit, is to be able to not admit what you don't know, while not betraying what you don't know, you don't know. Anyway, I was doing this kind of self-protective dance that I think we all do. And so when he said this, and he clearly knew that I had been going along with him, I was furious. I remember standing outside and afterward and just feeling like so embarrassed, so like pompous and stupid, and angry at him for having chosen to do that, which he didn't have to. He could have just told me the story the other way around, about how he created this character. And it took me a little while. It was probably the next day, maybe the day after that. I was at the art museum, the Historical Art Museum in Vienna, just looking at art. They have wonderful Vermeers there. And I was thinking how soothing it was to kind of look at that light, the way it's painted, wondering what it was like for people in the 17th century who saw it. Did it just seem ordinary, or was it also kind of soothing to them? And suddenly I remembered that I'm an art historian and that I had just had an art experience, because I actually do a kind of art history that stresses reception, or the way that a work of art shapes the experience of the viewer, and how that is different across time and across different cultures. But I had sort of forgotten that in my embarrassment, that he had actually given me a very particular aesthetic experience. I liked it much less than the Vermeers, but it was powerful, to be sure. And right then I realized that the whole time he had been talking and telling me the story, I was too busy thinking about my own self-image to ask any questions that would have actually helped me learn what it was he was saying, let alone to just say, oh, no, I don't know, please tell me, which would have been the obvious thing to do. And then for the next 24 hours, all I had been doing is sort of rehearsing these diatribes about, dignity of the individual, and why it was that he was so wrong to do what he did. And all of a sudden that just stopped. And curiosity came back, which is, of course, why I do what I do. And it felt amazing. And I was fascinated, and I kept thinking about it the whole time I was in Vienna, and I have not stopped thinking about it since then. So it's been a long time that I have been thinking about this, and that's because neither Safia nor I was alone in what had happened. She had lots of company in contemporary art as an invented figure, and I had a lot of company in terms of people who were having strange epistemic knowledge experiences with situations concocted by artists. Let me show you this art of difficult knowing. Between around 1992 and let's say 2015, we have artists introducing Lebanese historians, Soviet cosmonauts, a Black lesbian movie star in the US, a Colombian laundress, a Viennese hoarder, among other unverifiable people. There was a self-coronated beauty queen who toured Canada as Miss Canadiana. There was the impression given that call-ins to a reality TV show would determine which immigrants received asylum. There was a not really censored exhibition, several never-made movies. Europe Has a Mission. This was an attempt to do an American-style action film with the EU as the star. There was a sham supermarket in Czechoslovakia, staged marriage proposal in New York, an unconfirmed epidemic, which is actually a knowledge epidemic, and a number of dubious abortions. Artists gave us archives that they created There was a fabricated religion, questionable military units, and this faked vacation by art students in the UK. There was an organization of Christian Zionists in Dallas, a school of amateur Freudian analysts in Coney Island, New York. Viewers and citizens were convinced for a brief time that Nike was going to be changing the name of the Karlsplatz in Vienna to Nike Ground or Nike Platz. Artists also were busy making claims about museums' collecting practices. This was at the Brooklyn Museum in 2009 when the group, the Yes Association, made a fairly credible claim that the museum had agreed to collect art according to gender and ethnic quotas going forward, which caused a lot of discussion and of course turned out not to be true. We had an unverifiable bioengineered bunny, a unconfirmed albino penguin. We had the proposal on live TV of a market in human rights. This means this was on the model of carbon cap and trade. And the idea was that countries that wanted to torture would buy credits from those that refrained. There were faux archaeological sites, examples. There was made up research. There were simulated suicides. There was a simulated nuclear bomb when a group attacked a local weather cam. There may have been a balcony built on the 92nd floor of the World Trade Center in New York. There were possible religious conversions, art materials expeditions to Chernobyl, and a natural Vaseline mine, among other creative interventions. The only thing that we didn't get really from these artists is a name for what they were doing. And to be fair, I'm not sure that many of them would have thought that what they were doing was had a common purpose. Each of them was responding to some particular set of events or subjects that they came to this idea of presenting something fictional as if it were factual, so that it was invested with belief by viewers. They created this spectatorial experience, this viewer experience of epistemic glitch, like I had experienced in Vienna. One way to think about this is in the Western tradition that associates art with deception, going back to the idea of trompe-l'oeil, or trick the eye, right, where a visual illusion is created. And here we have a representation of the famous story of Zeuxis at the beginning of the Western art tradition. He was a famous artist who was able to trick the birds with his painted grapes and then became tricked himself. So if trompe-l'oeil is part of this Western tradition, it's a tricking of the eye, right? It's visual knowledge that's at stake, where illusion or reality become hard to distinguish. In parafiction, in this contemporary art, it's not visual knowledge, it's knowledge as such. One of the interesting things that I realized as I started doing this research was that these stories of parafiction were full of agents of knowledge. Cheryl Dunye, as a researcher in her film, The Watermelon Woman, spends much of the film in archives and libraries. We have artists using journalism, surveillance, archaeology, and other sciences, performing as museum docents, right? All of these are knowledge experts, producers and conveyors of knowledge. And this is happening in works of art where the primary aesthetic experience is epistemological, right? It's of a knowledge experience is the aesthetic experience. And often that's sort of represented within the work by these figures of knowledge. The first sort of point I wanted to make is that, to me, because all of this suggests that we get this enormous constellation of artworks, which is to say, things made in different places and times, not in, most of them not with knowledge of one another, that appear at a particular time because there's some kind of cultural problem. And in this case, that cultural problem is knowledge. And for the last 3 decades, parafiction has been the art of contemporary knowledge problems. It has been calling for certain skills, I'm going to suggest, and certain values as it brought viewers into contact with changing historical conditions for conveying and holding knowledge. Those are political conditions, they're mediatic, meaning the internet was a big factor. They're cultural, they're economic, they're political, and they metastasized in sometime around 2015. And we know well how it has continued to be one of the challenges that democracy itself has been facing. Parafiction then, this art from before, while this problem was developing, the conditions were changing, were growing and changing, can become a kind of archive in itself. This artwork, if we look back at it and we look carefully at what these kind of artists as sensitive figures who are aware of what's happening and who are then shaping viewer experiences in significant ways, how this can be a kind of archive, a kind of resource for those of us who want to think in new ways about what kind of knowledge and knowing, values and virtues, behaviors, and capacities we need in this period to challenge the worst and encourage the best in our culture of knowledge. Let me show you what I mean. More knowledge figures, sorry, explorers. Oh, and psychics. All right, so let me show you what I mean with reference to a very famous performance artwork from 1990 to 93 by Guillermo Gomez Peña and Coco Fusco, a Mexican and Cuban-American artist who, in the year of the quincentennial of Columbus's discovery of the New World, presented themselves as members of an undiscovered tribe from an island in the Gulf of Mexico that somehow we had not brought into the purview of geographic or cultural knowledge since Columbus's time. And they presented themselves as these natives who were now going on tour to show themselves to the people of Europe and Australia and the US and Argentina. As you can see, their getup was not representing any one particular culture. In fact, they started doing this as a satire, and they thought it would be kind of hilarious to create this totally postmodern pastiche of different signs and symbols of otherness, to take the long tradition of colonized peoples being taken as specimens and represented Columbus sent people to the royal court, natives of Hispaniola. And starting then right on through the Renaissance and into the 1930s, we have all kinds of versions of the native villages at World's Fairs, for example. The Barnum and Bailey Circus had people from a particular African tribe as part of the show. And it's basically this phenomenon that's been called the human zoo that is kind of embodiment of a colonialist understanding of the other and of the native. And so they thought they were using all of that as a kind of metaphor, a satirical metaphor for the relations for what it is like to be an artist of color in a world where their work was both in demand and marginalized at the same time. So they were sort of reimagining all of the people in this tradition as themselves having been performance artists of a kind. So this is two undiscovered Amerindians visit the West, and it was quite a sensation. It started in Madrid, it was in Chicago and Irvine, California, Sydney, it was at the Smithsonian in Washington, it was at the Field Museum in Chicago, and it was at the Whitney Museum in New York and a number of other places, as they spent 3 days each time as specimens in this golden cage. They performed their quote unquote native customs, they watched TV, and they invited the audience to have their picture taken with them. For a fee, they could feed them bananas. I mean, it was pretty gross. And one of the fascinating things, of course, is that they thought it was going to be a satire, but at least half the people, they think, took it very literally, assumed that they were representatives of this tribe from this island, and set themselves to kind of figuring out what was going on in the situation, often exhibiting kind of all of the worst sides of what you would think of as the colonialist, racist, unconscious. There were people who were outraged that human beings were being treated this way, who called the museum and canceled their memberships in this sort of well-intended but patronizing way, never thinking for a second that they could have had agency in the situation. And there were people who, exhibited all the kind of sexualized, racialized, violent forms of a colonialist understanding of their relationship to people who were presented as quote unquote native. And that's this piece. One of the things that was fascinating is that there were so many people who, in the kind of documentation that we have from all of these different places, were trying really hard to figure out what was going on, but they didn't have a sort of the construct of performance art, right, of kind of theater that is not in a theater. And they were reading all these signs of hybridity and intercultural play that were in the cage and in their costumes and in their pretend language and their dances, and trying to make them fit with the idea of the undiscovered tribe. And for them, what happens is that has to be Stone Age, right? So that their very ability to kind of coexist in time with contemporary viewers was causing all kinds of problems. So why are they wearing sneakers? Does she shave her legs? How is that possible? They were reading all of these signs and trying to figure out what was going on. So they were being skeptical. They just were being skeptical in a way that was kind of pre-programmed by the idea of the primitive that runs deeply through modern culture. So that's this piece. And it was, as I said, in the Columbus quincentennial year. And it was a kind of reversal of the idea of discovery, where the artists felt that they got to discover a lot about the people who were interacting with them. This is at a time when there's a kind of massive cultural shift happening the first time, associated with the idea of multiculturalism. And this had been activated by Native American activists of all kinds to sort of focus some of the critique of contemporary conditions on this idea of Columbus discovering America, because it was such a fundamental ideological and epistemic error. So this protest at University of Wisconsin is just a good example of how the registering this kind of switch in this particularly epistemic politics of discovery was really important for stimulating a lot of debate about all of our knowledge of history, of national identity, etc. Lots of conversations, right, about school curricula and so on, where the efforts to create change were coming from the left. But for the artists and for the viewers of this piece, what I wanted to point out is that for everybody who had a difficult time, and there were lots of different kinds of difficult times, the artwork almost projects in reverse. They almost project in reverse a way of knowing that would have not had such problems. What I mean is that there is a kind of post-colonialist way of knowing that would have set you up for a very different understanding of the piece. And so one of the elements of this would be just a kind of presumption of bidirectionality. That is to say, there's a sort of Western epistemic assumption about a subject of knowledge, you, and an object of knowledge, the people presented to you in this situation. And it's a one-way knowing relationship, which is obviously false. But if you were thinking about it that way, if you had been thinking about what they were seeing, how you were being studied, you would have had a different situation. And that, of course, is sort of maps onto the Columbus discovering narrative, or the sort of epistemic shift that had such important politics at the time. Another thing would be to assume partial perspective. Assume that what you know is conditioned by where you are and your experiences, as opposed to the assumption that it is normative, or objective. Gomez Pena played with this a lot in the play with language in his performances, but we see it in other kinds of parafictional situations as well, where if you, depending on your sort of geographical and cultural trajectory, you will have different levels of access to the fictionality of what you're being presented with. So if you're bilingual or trilingual, you may recognize certain jokes that give up the illusion that are tells much sooner than if you don't. And that's something that, or you might, even if you're from a particular place, recognize an actor or recognize a massive anachronism in the presented fiction, so that different people have different perspectives on it. And if we start with that kind of understanding, then we also are thinking that there are perspectives that have better access to knowledge than our own. So a stance of humility is part of this sort of post-colonial package of knowledge modes that would have helped the viewers of this piece. Another piece of this that's a sort of lesson that can be taken from the experience actually has to do with the documentation, which is, would be pretty embarrassing, I think, for a lot of the people pictured as they try to figure it out. And they've been represented in the sort of criticism and literature as sort of that the assumptions and biases reflect back on their character and beliefs. And so one of the interesting things about parafiction is actually that it has to take place over time. And so there's a model of knowing, of knowledge itself as something that is processual. And if we have that in mind, then seeing what each individual says or does at one moment is only saying one moment of their journey through the piece. And that and their shifts in knowledge are what the artwork wants to have happen. So what I'm saying about parafiction is that we have these fictions presented as facts, and there are ways to read these in terms of very abstract philosophical questions about truth and our access to it. But I think they're more case studies in historically specific ways of knowing, and in a kind of vernacular epistemology of everyday ways of knowing. And that this is what these contemporary artworks were engaging with in all of these different ways in this period. So if we think of it as art that reveals something about our vernacular ways of knowing, what I want to know is, what are those epistemic skills, proclivities that we value? What do these reveal about what vocabulary we have for describing our knowledge experiences? What aspects of knowledge experience do we pay attention to, and how are these historical? Another example, this is a piece by the artist Fred Wilson, or part of a piece where he went through the De Young Museum in San Francisco, and he just changed the labels on artworks so that the language that's normally used for pre-Columbian or African non-Western objects is transferred into the way European artifacts are presented. Again, that sort of shift and spin. Wilson also gives us a really important piece. This is in 1991 at the Old Whitney Museum of American Art, where Wilson was invited to give a lecture, a gallery talk to docents, the people who work in the museum and give tours, or volunteers who give tours. And he was going to talk to them about the representation of African Americans and African American culture in the museum, or lack thereof, in the Whitney's collections. So they had a very nice lunch beforehand, and Wilson, who's African American himself, met with these folks. Then he says he will meet them down in the gallery for his lecture. Everybody goes down to the gallery and stands around. They're just walk past the sign that says, "Here's Fred Wilson's lecture," and they wait until finally the security guard in the corner comes forward and says, "Hey, let's get the show on the road." Of course, it was Fred Wilson himself, and he had just changed into a security guard's outfit and become invisible to people who had just been having lunch and chatting with him. That is a situation that I bring up both because parafiction has been a way of thinking about knowledge and relationships across different kinds of social difference, but especially race, for this whole 30-year period. It's sort of a microcosm of the type of problem that parafiction can address, and we can read it as a kind of a kind of lesson that may or may not have been learned about what we need to be participants in a multiracial, multicultural environment. In other words, we have to be able to tolerate epistemic friction. I think that what he was pointing out, or what the piece sort of performs, is the difference between that nice sort of well-intentioned, I'm going to learn about racism and African-American history, where it is, again, this object outside of the self as the subject of knowledge, and instead having an experience of what the philosopher Jose Medina calls epistemic friction, in which you are involved, and what you're learning about is your relationality with the supposed object of knowledge, so that you're implicated in the very thing that you thought you were able to see from outside. And it must have been very unpleasant to experience. And I think that that's precisely the point. So this is a way that parafiction and that viewer experience of epistemic change across time is mobilized to, back in 1991, to suggest a kind of way of thinking about how we white people are going to understand the perspectives on us, right, from people of color, and about implication, right, that it's not enough to say, oh, everybody's included and everyone should be respected. There's going to be harder work than that to do. And that's the kind of epistemic work that Wilson was engaging with in that piece. Medina says that to have epistemic friction to change white consciousness, these have to be actual embodied encounters, specific events, lived disruptions that trigger the fracturing of one's subjectivity. That's that hard work. And he actually says, wouldn't it be great if there were some way of stimulating that kind of event that some of us have in our lives that are so important for what we learn and how we understand ourselves in the world? Wouldn't it be great if there was some way of causing that to happen, which is in philosophy, not contemporary art history, but that's exactly what I think some of these parafictional artists had discovered, is a technology, a kind of aesthetic technology to make precisely that occur. So there's, as I've been talking about, this sort of prehistory of post-truth, it is, I hope, presenting a kind of alternative way of thinking about our condition, and one that would be an alternative both to the post-truth mentality that cares, that does not invest value in accuracy, and doesn't hold people responsible for acts of deception, that it's something that can be very different than that, and very different than the left's response circa 2016, which was a kind of call to order, that we've gone way too far in all of this thinking about critiquing science and history, and we need to come back to a way of respecting truth as a fundamental aspect of our aspirations as thinkers and as people. So I like the fact that there are these two books called The Death of Truth, representing in exactly opposite ideological positions, and suggesting perhaps that this model of death, assault, saving and rescuing of truth is maybe not the way to go. So let me show you another example of a kind of epistemic set that got mobilized by artists in the 2000s. And that is a kind of problematic about self-themeness, about consistency. That is something that these artists, the Yes Men, in this kind of lovely photograph, that underlies, I think, the epistemic experiences that their work can produce. So they were early artists involved with the internet, and their first contribution was some shareware to duplicate websites and then allow the user to change just the text so that it looked completely convincing, which they were doing for purposes of satire. They got some notoriety when candidate George W. Bush said there should be some limits to freedom after their false site, with these basically somewhat benign now seeming satirical changes went live. They also famously duplicated the sites of corporations and organizations that they saw as responsible for the ills of a neoliberal kind of globalization and environmental destruction for the sake of profit. In other words, they were anti-corporate globalization activists. And this was their version of the Dow website. I kind of love the little in the upper left. Did you know Dow was responsible for the birth of the modern environmental movement? Because the 1962 book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson about DDT started today's environmental action groups. Of course, that DDT is produced by Dow, and so it's a nice kind of send up of greenwashing, and that's what they did. They made those, and they made these websites, and then sometimes the websites got activated as if they were real in situations where somebody wanted a representative of Dow Chemical, say, to come be interviewed on the news on the anniversary of the world's largest chemical disaster in Bhopal, India, that Dow arguably has responsibility for because of its absorption of the company Union Carbide. Complicated historical story, but Dow has always insisted that absolutely they have everything had been resolved when they took over the company, and they have no responsibility for the people of Bhopal who continue 2 generations later to have health problems, for the site that is still leaching chemicals into the groundwater. And so it was very unusual when a Dow representative wound up on the BBC announcing that Dow now accepts full responsibility, is going to remediate the site, is going to provide lifetime health care to people affected by the disaster, and who basically, for the 2 hours that this news was out in the world before the BBC issued its retraction, realizing that it was not a representative of Dow Chemical, it was one of the Yes Men, that for those 2 hours, there was this kind of different bottom line, that maybe there could be a corporation with an ethical bottom line instead of a purely monetary one. Of course, that's not good for stockholders of the company, and the price actually did dip before coming back, and there was no actual economic harm done. But there was a lot of imaginative possibility produced by what the Yes Men did. And they take this idea of the faux website and that link. And in a piece like this, they create a whole alternate possible world for that brief time opens up. They did it again in later in 2009. This was the day after the elections in 2008. Obama won, but they wouldn't have known that when they produced. It was not just the Yes Men. It was the Yes Men in collaboration with dozens of other people, including one of the leaders was the artist Stephen Lambert, no relation, to produce a special edition of the New York Times, physically produced, 16 pages. It was a whole section. All of it was written in complete New York Timesese, and all of it was announcing the sort of, it was a kind of wish fulfillment of leftist demands at the time. The true cost tax plan, the sane economy, and of course, an end to the Iraq War, which had not happened in 2008. This is a different picture. They handed out something like 50,000 copies of the paper one morning in November, and it was so convincing that people who took it up had to went through a little version of this parafictional experience in a very, very short time, right? Because it's not, it doesn't take much reading to realize what's going on there. They said it takes about 14 seconds. Not sure how they timed it. But that 14 seconds is the time of a kind of different reality. It's like, I think of it as a reality hyperlink that opens up, that they are able to produce with work like this. And that's at a time when the hold of the sort of possibilities are, the ideological possibilities had been so restricted. And so this moment of being able to imagine otherwise that the Yes Men are able to create. These photographs, they're stills from the Yes Men's film, allow us to kind of see that in motion, the process of going through this range of emotional and epistemic experience as you kind of grapple with what it is that is and isn't true in this trompe-l'oeil kind of experience. Which ultimately is one of the important things I think that we can learn from parafiction, is about knowledge as a process, knowing really as the thing that we can talk about rather than knowledge itself. And I think that with that, I should stop.
First question is, when we speak of post-truth, are we not giving comfort to those who make claims that are false?
One way I would understand that is to be saying, recognizing this as a condition would sort of allow it to take hold. If I'm understanding that, I actually think the model I've kind of suggested of different epistemic sets, different culturally and historically specific ways of knowing that involve habits and beliefs and capacities and values and virtues, all to do with knowing that these kind of sets that we have are historical and cultural and change. And I do think that what we've seen in conspiracy theory and all of what gets lumped under that term post-truth is a kind of emergent epistemic set that has a lot of traction in certain parts of the culture. And that it is, if those of us who find that deeply problematic, that it's incumbent on us to find ways of countering it that are not just return to order. You have to do better fact checking and work harder to read more news sources. That actually parafiction might suggest that there's another contemporary epistemic set. So it's not the classical epistemology that kind of colonialist view was tapping into, of a certain kind of objectivity that we now know has been used, has given an incomplete understanding of many of the world's people, right? That all of this is that we can have an alternative to both the old as an epistemic model, and also resist the kind of logic of post-truth. And by that I mean curiosity, right? Bidirectionality, situatedness, the possibility, the ability to be surprised. All of these are these kind of values that these art performances can be understood to have been sort of putting out into the culture, that maybe there's still time to learn from.
Second question is, with the rise of generative AI and with well-structured answers, how do we reduce our bias to fall prey to believing fiction as fact?
So my experience with this, researching this kind of art, is that we take fiction as fact very, very easily, more easily than the artists ever think that we will. And that psychologists can explain, in terms of evolutionary psychology, why that is. It makes sense that we start from a position of trust. So the AI produced writing or content is complicated, right? Because it's not inherently fiction. It's just generated by an intelligence that isn't the author's. So the parafiction would be that this is what I wrote, or the deception would be I wrote this. And I think that that's just going to be a line that is going to be very, very blurry. And I'm not sure that there's any way. It'll be interesting to see what artists do with it, but I'm not sure that, again, that sort of defense, that kind of bulwarks against this change in the way that we know and think and produce knowledge, that we might need some different values, some different ways of thinking about what are the habits of good knowers under these conditions.
Thank you, Carrie, for that.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Carrie, again. And thanks to all of you who have joined us today. We hope you'll join us for more signature events soon. Thank you for joining.